Native people had a keen awareness of the soil and how their cultural practices kept the soil healthy. And this is globally in all kinds of systems. And fire was one of the key ways they kept soil healthy, because when that pyrogenic carbon I mentioned, they're like bits of charcoal in the soil, can last up to 5,000 years. If you look at it under a microscope, it contains lots of pores. Those pores hold water. When there's a drought year, they hold water from the wet years. That they're like sponges. Additionally, pyrogenic carbon greatly increases the nitrogen cycle, and that's the flow of nutrient to trees. So by eliminating cultural burning, we did damage to these forests without realizing it.
Hey everybody, what's happening? Welcome to Your Forest. My name is Matthew Christoph, and on this podcast, we talk about the environment and the science of sustainability. Now, today's episode is all about the concept of two-eyed seeing. Now, this idea was introduced by Mi'kmaq elder Albert Marshall, and I got the following line from a TED Talk because I thought it summed it up very, very well, the TEDx talk by Rebecca Thomas, and she described it as such. Two-eyed seeing is a way of seeing the world. It takes the strengths of both the colonized world and the indigenous world and asks that the user see through both lenses simultaneously to find success. Now, this is the idea that we can see through lenses of both cultures and we may be able to find a better solution. I thought that this was a fascinating conversation to have. And just imagine, instead of seeing only through a single lens, only one perspective, one life view, one set of values, imagine if we can instead find a way to see through more lenses, different values, different perspectives. This will surely enrich our decision-making ability. It has to, right? It'll help us stand up for all values in a good way. And so to have this discussion, I brought on Dr. Cristina Eisenberg. So she was one of the lead authors on this really incredible report called Braiding Indigenous and Western Knowledge for Climate-Adapted Forests, an Ecocultural State of Science report. Now, her and three other lead authors, Susan Pritchard, Michael Paul Nelson, and Paul Hesberg, co-wrote this report with another huge amount of people. I think like 30-some people helped co-write this report. And the report is incredible. It explains how we can all accomplish two-eyed seeing. It's a detailed explanation of forest stewardship methods and how they can be applied in relationship to this idea of two-eyed seeing. And it was just such a great conversation. Cristina is the Associate Dean for Inclusive Excellence, as well as the Mabel Clark McDonald Director of Tribal Initiatives and Natural Resources at Oregon State University. She is a community ecologist, and her whole focus is on this idea of seeing through both Western science and Indigenous knowledge to seek out creative solutions that serve everyone. So, yeah, as you can imagine, great conversation. I loved it. I learned a lot, so I hope you do as well. Sponsors for this episode, West Fraser is the number one sponsor. They've been with me almost since the very beginning, and I cannot do this without them. So thank you, West Fraser, for all of your support. It's been incredible. And GreenLink Forestry is the second sponsor. Been with me since the beginning. Again, not possible without them. Thank you, GreenLink. Now, without any further messing around, let's dive into this amazing, intricate conversation about the concept of two-eyed seeing and the ultimate in forest stewardship. Here we go. So first of all, I think I want to get into you a little bit, let people know you, who you are, what you're about. So a brief introduction into yourself, Cristina, and then I want to follow that up with how this report came to be. You know what I mean? What was the intentions and how did this work begin? So, go ahead. Start with a little preamble about yourself.
Okay, nisto anagok nistaki kakatusaki. Hello, my name is Mountain Star Woman. I'm of Raramuri and Western Apache heritage. I'm also known as Dr. Cristina Eisenberg. I'm the Associate Dean for Inclusive Excellence and Director of Tribal Initiatives and a professor at the Oregon State University College of Forestry in Corvallis, Oregon. My role in my position is to lead tribal initiatives. I founded the Indigenous Natural Resource Office, and I'm the director of that office, and within it is the Traditional Ecological Knowledge Lab. And I lead research projects funded by the U.S. federal government with tribal nations in Montana on prairie restoration, and in Oregon, a large project with 5 tribes in the western part of Oregon on forest ecocultural restoration. So all the work that I do and have been doing for decades combines Western knowledge with Indigenous knowledge, with both being the best forms of science and brought together. My background is I have a PhD in forestry and wildlife, and I have worked extensively with prescribed burning, with fire, and with wildfire as well. And I look at how whole systems work together. So I'm a community ecologist. Personally, I'm a first generation scientist. My mother had a 4th grade education. My father had a middle school education. I grew up in an ultra traditional household where girls were not supposed to go to college. And I did go to college, and I followed my passion, and it was always forestry. One of my youngest, earliest memories was we used to live in Vancouver, BC, when I was a small child, and my dad did not like to go to church on Sunday. We were Catholic. So his excuse one Sunday to get out of going to church, and I was 3 years old at the time, was that he needed to take me for a walk. And he took me into the old growth in Stanley Park before it blew down.
Right.
And
okay.
He was not an ecologist, but he introduced me to ferns and lichens into these huge ancient cedars. And I remember vividly that walk and the deep connection I felt, and also the spiritual feeling that forest was his church, right? And so that has stayed with me all my life, and that's why I ended up with a PhD in forestry, because I was very concerned about what was happening to forests in North America, but also globally, and our lack of understanding of what we needed to do to care for those forests and also provide for, human needs.
Absolutely. I can relate to that last little bit of the forest is your church, right? Your place of spiritual connection. And I can relate to that. I also grew up Catholic and never truly fell into it, right? It never just didn't work for me for whatever reason, but I did always feel a deep connection to forest. So I can totally relate to that. And I think the same thing for me, right? That's why I'm doing what I'm doing too. Want to make sure that those places exist and are healthy forever for everybody, right? And I love that. Thank you for that. I appreciate that. That it's important for us to understand, I think, those deep connections before we have these conversations that are themselves very deep and complicated, right? So thank you. So this report, Braiding Indigenous and Western Knowledge for Climate Adapted Forests, an Ecocultural State of Science report. How did this come about for you? Clearly, it seems to me like it's kind of a culmination of all of your work up until now, along with the other 36 authors I think that are in here. But can you tell me a little bit about the intentions of this report and how it came to be?
Yeah, so there is some keen awareness by pretty much everybody that we are living through a climate crisis. And with regard to forests, it's really becoming a holocaust. And fires like the Kenow wildfire in Alberta, or the fire that, just recently burned up Jasper and vicinity, mega fires burning in the far north for months, fires burning were in an unprecedented manner, right? Humanity is keenly aware of this. And leaders in the United States, federal leaders, decided to take very direct action at bringing together a diverse community of folks to provide guidance and really increase awareness and understanding. And so they saw, and by they I mean the White House, the U.S. White House, people in Congress, the top leaders in federal agencies such as the Forest Service and the Bureau of Land Management. Those are the agencies in the U.S. that are responsible for stewarding our nation's forests. They said we have to get the information that we need and the guidance that we need so that we do this right. And we're running out of time. And this was after, unprecedented fire seasons, one after another. Each year is like the worst on record. And then the following year that's surpassed both in the size, severity, and impacts of these wildfires on forests. So what happened was that the project that I lead in Montana was noted as an exemplary project for partnerships with tribal nation, and that's funded by the Bureau of Land Management and working with tribes on the northern Great Plains, just south of Grasslands National Park in Canada, just south of that medicine line, the U.S.-Canada border, with one of the most impoverished and stressed Indigenous communities, the Fort Belknap Indian community. The government had been trying to partner with them on grassland restoration for decades, and the tribes didn't want to do that because there was a lack of trust. And so I had been working with the Kainai First Nation in Canada for over 10 years, and the U.S. federal government were aware of that work, and they said, can you teach us how to do this? And could you lead a project? And I said, yes, but it needs to be decolonized, and that's going to cost the government money. So they had me write a proposal, and I got awarded a 5-year grant, and now it's become a 9-year grant. It's been extended.
Fantastic.
And the results of that were so successful in terms of the quality of the partnerships, the impacts on the community, particularly tribal youth, and the science we were doing, that I was asked to testify in Congress about it. And at the same time, I was asked to join a consultation meeting, a scoping meeting with some of the top scientists in the forestry scientists in the U.S. This was about old growth forests and the future of old growth forests and climate resilience. So there were about 6 scientists in this small group, and everybody was talking about, you got to get more trees on the landscape and, above ground carbon, and very standard cutting edge Western science perspectives. And then I was the only Indigenous person in that group. And I said, excuse me, but have you considered that Indigenous people have been stewarding these forests since time immemorial? And they're greatly departed from what they looked like 500 years ago as a result of Euro-American settlement. And have you considered that cultural burning was a key tool that Indigenous people used? So Forest Service leaders asked me to formally write up those comments, and I did. And it was based on that commentary that I made that was used to inform the drafting of other policy documents that have come since then. And this was in 2022. Both of those things, the testimony and the comment, that I was, people started thinking about me as somebody who could provide guidance. At the same time, my colleague Susan Pritchard is a brilliant fire ecologist who has also been working with tribal nations. She's been mentored by Dr. Frank Lake, for example, and Dr. Paul Hesberg, who is an eminent fire ecologist with decades of experience. Susan, Dr. Pritchard is at the University of Washington, and her work had been noted in the Pacific Northwest with regard to fire and the departure of fires to how historically they had taken place. She was invited, and I was invited by Forest Service leaders to write a report. And when Susan and I met, we had never worked together before.
Okay.
We immediately recognized each other as kindred spirits.
Yeah.
And so that's how the report ensued. And she and I immediately felt that we needed to bring together a diverse team of co-authors, ones that had multiple perspectives from multiple cultures, authors from Canada, authors from the U.S. So our author team consists of 1/3 Indigenous people, 1/3 scientists in universities who are non-Indigenous, and 1/3 U.S. federal employees.
Okay.
Yeah, and we call it the Braiding Sweetgrass Report. So I'm holding in my hand a braid of sweetgrass, and you see how flexible it is, right?
Right.
And if you were to take one of these blades of grass and bend it, it would snap, but together they're incredibly resilient. So Robin Wall-Kimmerer, who is another forest ecologist, and she's Potawatomi, and she's at State University of New York. She wrote the book Braiding Sweetgrass, and she uses sweetgrass as this metaphor for one of these strands represents Indigenous knowledge. The other strand represents Western science. The middle strand represents our common deep existential concern about what's happening to forests worldwide. And that's what brings us together, because Western science and Indigenous knowledge represent two vastly different worldviews. Western science has historically been very linear, and it's changed more recently a bit, but it's very hypothesis driven and finding proof and moving forward in a very direct way. And it is also based on capitalism, and that is finding solutions that can benefit people in multiple ways, including financially.
Absolutely.
Indigenous knowledge is based on cultural humility. So the idea that humans are embedded in nature, such as that's how I felt when I took that walk in Stanley Park when I was 3, right?
Yeah.
And not only that, we're embedded in nature, and we're the dumbest creature in nature. And if we pay attention to what nature, like what the lichens are teaching us, right, we just might learn what we need to live well and thrive. And then the idea of reciprocity. So that means that the forest is here to take care of us, but we have a huge responsibility to take care of the forest. And that means we take what we need and we give back more to the forest. And the forest continues to nurture and care for us. And by the forest, I mean not just the trees, but the littles, the understory plants, the shrubs, the berry-producing shrubs, the traditional plants, the sweetgrass that's in the understory, the deer and the elk, the salmon, the animals that feed us, right? That provide essential cultural foods. So the Western worldview is nature, it's like this pyramid where here's nature and humans are at the very top, and we're the ruler of the universe. And so we use command and control methods to, So our report is, what if you brought together both worldviews, which we did with our authors, and what if together we found a path forward to restore resilience to forests and all forest types, not just the, lush coastal rainforests, but what if we came together across cultures as allies to figure this out?
I love that.
And that's our report in a nutshell. And it took 1.5 years to write it because we didn't agree about everything, and that's a healthy thing. It was a healthy form of intellectual debate across cultures, like, so what do we mean by resilience, and how do we get there, and and what is the role of cultural burning, and what if cultural burning isn't the whole answer, and so how does all this work together?
I love that. I think it's fantastic.
So the other thing is that the report was funded by the Forest Service, and it was also funded, we received very, very generous funding as well from charitable foundations, funding that enabled us to have a writing retreat at Harvard Forest and bring in all the co-authors who were able to attend, things like, so we had long walks in the woods, and so the writing process was not this linear thing. It was, we had very beautiful support to decolonize that process and do it in a way that involved, we had a writing retreat also in Washington, D.C. at the Forest Service headquarters in the Aldo Leopold room is where we met. And Aldo Leopold was one of the people who in the 1920s first noted that that climate change was affecting the nation's forests. He was doing a Forest Service survey. It was because of the removal of cultural burning by Indigenous people, and that we needed to restore that cultural burning, that fire suppression had vastly changed the structure of forests, and that these forests were very at high risk of catastrophic wildfire and diseases. So that was in 1920.
It's 100 years ago. We're still working it out.
Yeah, and so we met in the Leopold room, and we said, "What would Aldo Leopold think today?" Right?
Yeah.
Anyway.
No, that's beautiful. I think that's why I was so excited to read this report and to speak with you, is because I feel like a lot of conversations I've had on this are that conversation, and specifically the idea of braiding. Right, like just the title in itself captured me big time, like you had described with the Sweetgrass, because I think a lot of the discussion even stops there because there's a misunderstanding of what this co-management idea kind of looks like, right? And there's we can incorporate Indigenous knowledge, or we can enable them to do some kind of management, and the wording is all wrong, right? And the wording is still that of colonialism and of power dynamic, and of, it's all messed up, which is why I was so excited about this concept of braiding Indigenous and Western science, right? Like it's a really good way to put it, and just like, hey, these are, and I think I really especially appreciated the breakdown of Western science being this kind of this hard thing that it almost eliminates the human values. Like it's very just proof, and like you said, hypothesis. It almost removes the human aspect from it, whereas the Indigenous knowledge is wholly that. And so I think this is such an interesting opportunity, and the fact that you've been able to get as many people as you had to work together and to collaborate and to come up with some real solutions is incredible. And it's quite the accomplishment in and of itself to just get that many people to get together and agree on a report like this, right? So it's a huge accomplishment.
Susan had a lot to do with that. You have worked with other Indigenous leaders in forestry, and there are times when people say, well, can you prove that Indigenous knowledge is real?
Right.
And that's the point at which we check out of the conversation. Like,
Sure.
like, how do you even begin to answer that?
Yeah.
And so, Susan is an incredible partner. She's what we refer to in Indian country as an ally.
Mhm.
And Native people globally recognize that we very much need allies across cultures, because together we need to be this braid of sweetgrass, right?
Mhm.
And that is a lesson I learned. I was the chief scientist at Earthwatch Institute, where I had oversight on a global research program. I was based out of Harvard University, and the program was on 6 continents and involved 50 projects. Many of them involved partnering with tribal nations, indigenous peoples in places like Mongolia and Africa. And so what I learned there was that these challenges are universal, and the values that indigenous people have are also universal. Each community is vastly different, but our values are the same. And so with the Braiding Sweetgrass report, there were the colleagues that we had were all wonderful people, but this lack of intellectual understanding of what indigenous knowledge is about and why culture and spirituality is so intrinsic to it. Those are things that Susan was such an amazing ally in helping us have those conversations in a respectful manner. And that's reflected in our report. And the report is beautiful. It truly represents the best of what allyship can be.
That's fantastic. I love that. Oh, I'm so excited. So can I, before we get into the specifics of the report, because there's obviously a ton to talk about, I think it's important, and we've kind of covered the basis of it already, but I really like to cover the idea of two-eyed seeing and why that's an important topic to go into in this report.
Yeah, and there's this figure in this report that's a braid of sweetgrass, and within it it's like this cycle that has to do with partnering with tribal nations in how one does that. And, this was originally, the concept of two-eyed seeing was originated in Canada, in Eastern Canada, at a Canadian university, and it had to do with human health and education. So educators and people working as scientists to understand, efficacy of education, and also, people who were leaders in human health programs had these programs created that they applied to everybody the same, regardless of their culture or heritage. And they did not understand why those programs did not work well with the Inuit and other First Nations. They failed. There was the outcomes were very different for non-Indigenous peoples. So they then developed additional programming that was very specific for First Nations, and it failed as well. And so then a university scientist brought in a tribal elder. And the way one would bring a top Western science expert, and contract them to provide guidance. So this university professor brought in a tribal elder, and he introduced that term two-eyed seeing. So when you look at the world through one eye is Western science, the other eye is Indigenous knowledge, what you get is binocular vision. However, it only works if it's co-created. And there are, numerous Canadian scholars have done work on, what that means. How does two-eyed seeing work? And even what if one eye doesn't see as well as the other eye? And guess which is the weaker eye, right? When you're dealing with knowledge that has been present since time immemorial, right? So, read it all, around 13-ish, applied this to fisheries and in BC. So conservation of, species of fish that are at risk and working with First Nations on that. And my colleagues and I at Oregon State, this has not been applied to forestry before. So we created in our Braiding Sweetgrass report this model. And this was created by me, Tom DeLuca, and Michael Nelson. And there's a journal article that will be forthcoming about it. The two-eyed seeing model as applied to forestry. Mm-hmm. And there's also been in the U.S. a bunch of federal legislation having to do with tribal sovereignty. So if you're going to partner with a tribal nation, you don't collaborate, you partner, because tribal nations are sovereign nations with sovereignty rights. And so what are the steps you take? So what you do in two-eyed seeing is the minute that you have this glimmer of an idea that you want to create a natural resource conservation strategy for a particular area, that's when you start having those conversations with First Nations and tribal nations. Mm. And so you don't approach a tribal nation with this idea already in place, already having had meetings with your colleagues for months and the funding, set up, and say, hey, we are going to do this initiative for forest conservation or salmon conservation and restoration. So we'd like you to help. It has to be co-created from the start. And then from there, you start by identifying the need, identifying shared priorities for the work at hand, and then co-developing the methods. And when I mean co-creating, co-developing, I mean including tribal elders in the process. The First Nation, the whole community. Mm-hmm. And so you move from the, co-creating the methods to co-implementation. Mm. So you're scoping that stand of trees for treatment because it's experiencing beetle kill, right? And so you bring in tribal elders who have this ancestral memory of what that forest stand used to look like and, how it evolved over time. And together, and you bring in the very best Western scientists as well. And it's not even that both are equal. It's actually Indigenous knowledge is superior because it's the original knowledge. Yeah. But they both have this equal role in shaping the methods and the application of those methods. When applying those methods to do an ecocultural restoration, let's say, a silvicultural treatment in Western parlance, you try to provide as much funding for involvement of tribal youth, for example, jobs, to build capacity within the community. You fund elders the way you would fund a very famous Western science expert in their field, right? Mm-hmm. 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 And then you do assessment together, and together you decide, what does it mean? What are our measures of success? And they may be very different for an Indigenous community than for a federal or provincial or state agency. Yeah. And then after you've done this assessment together, the whole cycle repeats. So you go back to, the beginning and you say, okay, what have we learned here? And what are our shared priorities? Yeah. And you make adjustments. So what Susan and I call it is adaptive co-stewardship or adaptive co-management. But that's two-eyed seeing. And gotcha. And the figure we created has a braid of sweetgrass, encasing all of those steps in there.
That's fantastic. No, it's a really cool representation. I'll make sure to share it so people can find it. And this report I should put in also. This report it's open access, correct?
Totally open access, and it's through Susan Pritchard's lab at the University of Washington.
Absolutely. No, I'll make sure that that's in the show notes without a doubt, and I'll promote it in the introduction in the post too, just to make sure that people know where to find it. Because I think for folks that are listening to this, following through will be helpful as well. So absolutely, that's great. I think this whole concept of braiding and two-eyed seeing is just, it's a very refreshing look on all of the problems that we've seen coming down the pike. It's just, I feel like it's been coming for a long time. There's been a lot of talk about too much fire and too much this and climate change and all this. And we're all like, okay, we need to start creating resilience. And like, how do we do that? And then this is all coming together at the right time. Absolutely. Or too late, I guess you could say, but it's coming together at the last possible instant.
Better late than never, right?
Right. We could start now, and I think we're ready as cultures to start incorporating, or not incorporating, but to start embracing these ideas and actually like putting boots on the ground and doing the thing. Stop talking and actually start doing. Right. I love that. So. And actually, your last comment or one of your last comments was a perfect segue into the recommendations, right? The very first, there was 5 recommendations that came out of this report, and they were broad recommendations. Obviously, you detailed them exhaustively in the report, and the first one was adopt a proactive stewardship, and I think that idea of proactive is really, really important. And do you think that? And there was more to it. Like I think it was proactive, place-based co-stewardship is how you worded it.
Mm-hmm.
And so I think I want to start with just talking about proactive. What does proactive stewardship mean to you? And is what we have been doing, would you say, is reactive?
Yeah. In the US and Canada, our agencies that are responsible for our natural resources have historically operated in a very reactive manner. So there's a crisis, so you react, right?
Gotcha.
And some of this has to do with funding limitations, and some of it is cultural. And so these lands, they were taken, federal lands, state and provincial lands were taken from tribal nations, indigenous peoples, and people came from Europe and applied, because basically they were out of timber in Europe to build ships with. That was it. That was the primary reason for colonization, right? Mm-hmm. And so they said, great, we have all these forests, let's manage them. And they proceeded to do the same thing they were doing in Europe that hadn't worked. There's a reason why the Roman Empire collapsed, right? Yep. Mm-hmm. Unsustainable agriculture was a big part of that. And guess what? They failed here, right? Yeah. And so now we are really scientists from both cultures, federal agency leaders who are visionary are saying, you know what? We're doing this wrong. Yeah. And we need to really think forward and think about what is needed rather than wait for the next crisis to come along. So that's proactive.
Yeah, thinking about the 7 generations, that 250 years in the future, and what's coming, right? Especially with climate change being such an unknown, right? It's like that resiliency, building resiliency in the system is crucial. Yeah, absolutely, and doing it now.
Yeah, well, I'll tell you a quick climate change story. I raised my family. I'm a mother, and I waited till they were teenagers, and then they said, Mom, it's your turn. You have to go to school now. So that's when I started my graduate studies. And I got my PhD at Oregon State University, where I'm working now. And my first year, I had to take a graduate seminar class, and it was on climate change. And a very famous person, Bev Law, well, she wasn't that, she was earlier in her career then, but she was, she presented a seminar on her climate change models. And this was before they went public, right? Sure. And she had a worst case scenario, a moderate scenario, and, a least impact scenario. And she predicted at the time, this was 2006, that where we would land would be somewhere between moderate and least impact. by the time I finished my PhD in 2012, we had reached the extreme scenario.
Already.
Already. So the speed of climate change was exponential.
Yes.
And she's a world-class scientist who was brilliant and used the very best Western science in her modeling back in 2006. And so that gets to your point of, we don't even know, what could happen with climate change.
Yeah. So we better hedge our bets. Like we gotta get on board here. Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
Yeah, I'm with you there. So the proactive approach, I think, is, I don't think anyone can argue with that now, right? Like we're in the space, especially to use a timely example that maybe a little bit I don't know if it's unfair, but Jasper National Park going up, right? And the reactive approach to a lot of that. It's another one of those unfortunate examples of where proactive management, proactive stewardship could have made a big difference, right? But because of our Western desire to preserve, or whatever you want to call it, it kind of just limited all of that action, and it's a problem. So the proactive stewardship, I think, is undeniable.
Well, you're getting at the core of the problem is land management policies that we have. So you're talking about Jasper National Park. I worked in Waterton Lakes National Park. Parks are protected preserves, and they were created because of all of the rampant clear cutting and other abuses that were happening by, at the hands of colonizers. There were people in Washington, D.C. said, wait, we need to do something to save certain landscapes. So they created concepts of wilderness and national parks.
Again, reactive.
Yeah, reactive, right? But it's no touch, right? However, none of these landscapes had ever been no touched. It's all native land, and Indigenous people lived in and with, those ecosystems, stewarding them very actively. So what happens in a place like Jasper or Waterton or, other protected areas is the forest and your work has shown how the forest has greatly departed from historical conditions. And in those reserves, one is not allowed to touch them. So I had conversations when I was working in Waterton. They were doing prescribed burns, very large-scale prescribed burns, and I was studying their impacts of them. There, the forest cover, the aspen cover, for example, had encroached on the grassland. Bison used to be there, and they had been harvested to the point of extinction locally. Right. And so both hardwoods like aspen and also conifers like Douglas firs had encroached on the grasslands. The forest cover, there have been numerous studies in Alberta and BC about the huge increase in forest cover. And then when you add a protected status to that, the conversations that I had with park managers who were the most incredible progressive allies one could ever ask for, it's like, too bad, we can't go in there and thin the forest to restore it to a bit more of its historic conditions.
Yeah, it's tough.
So you end up with a situation like Jasper or Waterton, where the Kena wildfire in 2017, it burned up 130,000 acres, most of it with high severity. Yeah, so proactive means maybe in our report, it means maybe we need to rethink how we take care of reserves.
Yeah. Yeah, this no touch thing isn't working out. And we've known that for a while. It's not like this is a surprise to anybody. It's just been, how do you convince Western society that, that it's we need to burn around town or remove some of the trees that you walk your dog through to try and steward this landscape, even if it is by humans, right? This romantic notion that Western society has with leave nature alone, let it be, it'll take care of itself. It's so flawed. It removes the concept of humans being a part of this landscape and being a part of nature. And it's one that needs to change. I think it is changing, but it's frustrating when you see places like Jasper go up knowing, and everybody there knowing full well what needed to happen, but didn't happen because of political red tape or whatever, right? It sucks. I think I would like to dive into this concept of place-based co-stewardship as well, again, as part of the adopting proactive stewardship. So this place-based, to me, and the co-stewardship, is this the idea of kind of decentralizing power and allowing local Indigenous communities and local authorities to actually steward the local landscape at that level, like, giving them the authority to do that, make those decisions, and not having to reach out to the state level or province level and seek out permission? Is that what we're talking about?
Well, it's not quite that, but it is related to that. So
okay.
When we were tasked with writing this report,
mm-hmm.
and at the same time, the Forest Service was working on the National Mature and Old Growth Assessment and Inventory.
Uh-huh.
So our report, we were asked to create a one-size-fits-all solution or policy for how to steward mature and old growth forests in our report.
That's no challenge at all. One size fits.
And Susan really ran with this. Oh my God. She and I both said, well, that's just not going to happen because there's no such thing, because these forests are very different, right?
Right.
And
of course.
We said that to the Forest Service, and they said, okay, well, and they gave us total freedom with this report. So part one of the report has to do with policy and fundamental Western science and Indigenous knowledge and its role, fire. But part two, which is a longer part of the report, goes into the place-based strategies
mm-hmm.
and their ecocultural strategies based on forest types that are very different. There's a huge amount of variation. So place-based means you identify a stand that needs treatment and you listen to what that stand is telling you.
Mm.
And it's not a one-size-fits-all thing at all. And so the principles, even on an eco-regional, eco-cultural basis, are basically ethical and scientific principles that you go through a checklist, if you will. Does this have these characteristics? What are the leading threats here? What, bring in elders, what did this forest used to look like? And you identify in a very place-based manner the stands that are most highly at risk.
Mm-hmm.
And those are the ones that you then treat. And how you treat them is it's totally place-based. And you have certain tools, mm-hmm. but you bring in what the local tribes and also local community members who are not Indigenous, who have lived in that landscape, like in these rural communities for, 100, 200 years, those families. And they have this deep, deep knowledge. It comes from a different cultural perspective, but they have a lot of wisdom.
Yeah.
So you listen to those knowledge holders and you sit with that forest, and then you develop together using two-eyed seeing, these place-based proactive stewardship approaches. And in the U.S., the Forest Service is in the process of identifying those in each national forest, and there's 178 of them, the stands of old growth that are most threatened by climate change, and prioritizing, a proactive approach to stewarding them.
That's awesome. That's fantastic. It sounds like such a holistic way to go about stewarding landscapes, right? Stewarding forests, to not assume that, the research has all the answers, but to actually go into the cultural memory and, the place-based memory and to tease out what information you can from there and use that as a tool for creating holistic solutions. I think that's fantastic. Yeah, it's incredible, and it's I think it's a new way of it's an old way of doing things, but it's coming back around.
Yeah. And so I want to also, every word matters. Writing this was like writing a poem. So stewardship is different than management.
Yeah.
Management is something that you manage and control. Stewardship involves caring for a forest the way you take care of your family. It involves reciprocity. Mm-hmm. So you give, and you get, right? But you give more than what you take. And so that's stewardship. It's done with values that have to do with humans being embedded in nature and being responsible for nature the way one is responsible for one's family. So, and it's that seventh generation approach. And so every word in, these recommendations, just writing those recommendations took months.
Yeah.
And we achieved consensus, but a lot of it had to do with word choices,
Sure.
Very, very intentional writing.
Yes, absolutely. Yeah, I can appreciate that. I think it's funny the way, like, even in my mind, right? Like you pointed out an interesting point. Like management and stewardship in my mind were, almost interchangeable. But when you put them the way that you did, I'm like, oh yeah, you're right. Of course, that makes total sense. It's a different mindset. It's a different way of thinking about what you're doing and the intentions, right? Whereas management seems like this extractive thing where you're, but the stewardship of is, like you said, taking care of a family, right? Like it's just a different way of conceptualizing it. And I love that. That totally makes sense.
So we also used a family approach in writing this. So our core writing team, Susan and I are the lead authors, but there's two other authors we were a group of four that took leadership over the writing process in a very caring manner. Mm-hmm. And so there's Susan and myself, and then Dr. Michael Paul Nelson, who's at Oregon State University. He's an eminent environmental philosopher who specializes in ethics. Okay. And by the way, the Forest Service was so excited that we invited a philosopher to take the lead role because our whole report is a paradigm shift. And where does a paradigm shift come from? Mm-hmm. It comes from a shift in worldviews. Yes. And a shift in values to prioritize. It's ethics-based, these paradigm shifts. Like, this is not working. We need to do it differently, and we need to do it right. Mm-hmm. And the other person is Dr. Paul Hesberg, who I mentioned previously, who is Susan's mentor for decades. He is a key advisor to leaders in the Forest Service. He's a Forest Service employee. I think he's retired now. He's an incredible ally and an incredible scientist and human being. And so he was the person that really helped us when the braiding of the sweetgrass got tough, and he also helped us navigate the federal culture, the agency culture.
Important, so important.
Yeah, and I mean, this is our core writing team, and each of us was essential to the process. We were complemented each other. Mm-hmm. So, and so these recommendations, our whole team spent, weeks wordsmithing them, but Paul had a very strong hand, and so did Michael Nelson in these word choices. Yeah. So it's all like, they're not just words on a page, right.
It's very intentional, and that totally makes sense. I love that. I appreciate that that nuance for bringing that to the forefront, because I think it's important to point out how much work has gone into this and how intentional it is, right? So, all the forethought, all the it's very, very holistic. Like I said, it's very comprehensive, and I love it. So, I think I want to dive into the second recommendation that you guys put out there, which was recognize and respect tribal sovereignty and Indigenous knowledge, and I want to break down the difference in your mind and in the mind of the report between recognize and respect, because I feel like those are both, like obviously both are needed, but I think it's important to talk about that difference, because I think right now it seems like widely we might be at a place of recognition, but maybe not quite at a place of respect.
That's absolutely correct. And
Okay.
the recognition is federally mandated because of laws in the U.S. and Canada. These laws have been in place, some of them for over 100 years. Some of them, several of these laws came into place that, more specifically delineated sovereignty rights in 1994 in the U.S. But, it goes back to the treaty rights that recognize tribes as sovereign nations. And as sovereign nations, it's the same as if you're partnering with Germany.
Sure.
On something, right?
Yep.
You don't collaborate. You have, for a formal partnership, and you recognize each other's sovereignty. Those policies, those laws have been in place for a long, long time, and were seldom observed. And when, they were observed very sporadically. Yeah. And often disregarded. And that began improving in the last 50 years or so. In the 1970s, there was another cluster of laws that were passed. And then while we were writing our report, there were a series of presidential and secretarial orders that were published in the Federal Register in the U.S. So that really emphasized that we must recognize these sovereignty rights. The respect, though, is the missing piece. And some of it is due to outright racism.
For sure.
Some of it, about half of it is due to people being very well intentioned, but not really understanding how to do that. To help with that, I created a task force at Oregon State University in the College of Forestry, and we created a document, principles and best practices for working with Indigenous knowledge and partnering with tribal nations. And that has gotten a lot of attention. There's also the CARE principles that came out of the University of Arizona. Then there's the White House created this set of standards and principles for working with Indigenous knowledge and tribal nations. Together, those three documents provide this very strong foundation. But there's a lot of education that needs to happen. And one of the things that will be coming up is, as federal laws are finalized that call for partnering with tribal nations, very few people know how to do that right. And so there will be a lot of mentoring, training, working together across cultures to figure out how to do that. And I do that now. I'm doing some preliminary work on that for the Forest Service by hosting tribal roundtables, which are talking circles done in a decolonized way to enable for tribes to share their perspectives on what it means to steward a forest. How specifically, what are the things that can be done using traditional knowledge, and what are their concerns about partnering with federal agencies, and how can we all do this better?
Yes. I like that a lot. So, and I wanted to ask you about that specifically, because I did notice, like in the report, you mentioned the executive orders that came up, and I still noticed that in those executive orders, it was an official acknowledgement of Indigenous knowledge, but it still seemed to me like there maybe wasn't any mandate or any. It was like, hey, you have to acknowledge and you have to provide opportunity, but I was wondering if there was any weight. Was there enough weight behind those in your mind, or is there still more work to be done there?
Those orders have progressively carried more weight. But what is happening now is there are proposed amendments to the National Forest Management Act. So it's called the National Old Growth Amendment. Okay. And there's another one for the Northwest Forest Plan. The timeline for the NOGA, as the national amendment is called, it should be finalized by January, and it contains very strong language about requiring, that tribal sovereignty be observed. and some of what I described to you in the two-eyed seeing model. So those, and those are publicly accessible. They contain language like reciprocity,
Yeah.
seventh generation. They talk about co-stewardship and co-management. And so once those amendments go through, and they will be modified, there'll be, these are in draft form now,
Sure.
the draft environmental impact statement specifically for the NOGA, so they will have language that will be much stronger than what you see in Executive Order 14072.
That's great. That's what I was kind of hoping for. I was hoping that you see more, instead of just being like, yeah, we have to recognize that this is going on. It's like, hey, we actually like mandate some certain amount of change, right? So that's great. That's great to hear that that's coming. And obviously with the concept of recognizing and respecting, tribal and indigenous knowledge, we can't really do that without talking about past histories, past harms, and then also discussing how we know that knowledge, that tribal knowledge, that indigenous knowledge had an impact, and how we've messed with that over this time, right? So I would love to spend a little bit of time talking about past harms and why that's important to acknowledge in this conversation before we go forth into more specific strategies and ideas for stewardship.
Yeah. So in the U.S., what happened is that I explained that settler colonialism occurred because people were out of timber for building ships in Europe. Mm-hmm. They were also looking for things like gold, precious metals, minerals. Mm-hmm. But it was mainly driven by timber, mm-hmm. or lack thereof. And, clear cutting all the forests in Iceland and in Scotland. So they came here, and in order to do what they needed to do, they displaced indigenous people. They stole the land, and that involved genocide. So if Native people did not cooperate, they were killed, right? Prior to that, when Christopher Columbus came in the late 1400s, he brought with him diseases like smallpox, were on board his ships, and they had spread across North America. So when the settlers arrived in New England, Massachusetts, what is today Massachusetts, in the late 1600s, what they encountered was an indigenous population that had already been reduced by about 90%. And then they proceeded to reduce it by another 90%. And they took from tribes the most valuable timberlands. That is what they prioritized because, timber was money. Timber is what the United States was built on. And then there was forced assimilation. Children were taken in the U.S. and Canada and put into boarding schools, residential boarding schools. And the idea being, if you don't assimilate, you're going to die. But the other is, the only terms like the only good Indian is a dead Indian, mm-hmm. abounded.
Yep.
And kill the Indian, but save the man. That was the mantra of the residential school system. Yes. But guess what? We survived.
Flip on the middle finger.
Yes, and we regained some of our lands. Many of the treaties, most of them were broken in one way or another, and tribes in the U.S. and Canada have contested those treaties and made major victories. I know that happened with the Kainai First Nation, the Treaty 7, and, we are finding our way. And yes. So, but what all that did was it created huge intergenerational trauma. If your parents had to flee from massacres and live with nothing and had forced marches of hundreds of miles, as happened in the Pacific Northwest to the tribes when they were marched in the dead of winter to a reservation on the coast with no clothing, no warm clothing, having to carry everything on their backs. And if a child fell down, they were shot. We have that trauma today.
Yeah.
And so that's called intergenerational trauma. And it combines with climate trauma to create deep, deep issues in Indigenous communities that we are working together to resolve, and that the government is very aware of and is, part of the remedy is, these new policies for involving and honoring Indigenous people at the earliest stages in healing the damage done to forests.
So obviously, with the genocide of Indigenous people across North America and colonization taking over, recently there's been Western scientific understanding of how the ecology of the landscape changed drastically post-colonization. And I would like to shed some light on that change and how we propose maybe re-understanding, because I think right now Western society manages the landscape based off a baseline of the forest exists like this without people. We'll go in there and do what we want and it'll be fine. Whereas we know that that's not true now, and we have proof of that. Sans Indigenous knowledge, which has always been the proof but hasn't been recognized until very recently. So I just want to detail that ecological change that has happened.
Yeah. So Susan has been a co-author, and Paul and lead authors on many publications about this, and the change has to do with many things, but a key factor is fire, or lack thereof. Fire suppression, both wildfire and prescribed fire or cultural burning. And so I described the effects of, the diseases that were brought across by Columbus and other explorers, and how this wave of disease spread across what is today North America. And 90% of Indigenous people perished, and that was 90% of the fire that was being set by Indigenous people went away because of, reduction in the population. And then the settlers arrived in the 1600s, and there was another wave of fire suppression that moved westward with them in Canada and the U.S. at the same time.
Mm-hmm.
And so the fire records show in the Pacific Northwest, they show this drop off of fire frequency that starts like in the 1700s, before, the colonizers got here.
Right.
And then another sharp drop off in around 1830.
Gotcha.
Which,
okay.
Oregon was prioritized for colonizations because guess what? The U.S. federal government didn't want those Canadians taking this land. So they were like rushing to the coast because, the policy back then was, this was part of the doctrine of discovery, is whoever planted a flag at the mouth of a major waterway controlled that whole watershed. So that was the Columbia River. That was Lewis and Clark's expedition in the early 1800s, right? So, but anyway, the fire records match all of that. Mm-hmm. And then the fire scars, Andrew Michel, one of our co-authors, is a fire ecologist who has been cutting cookies, taking slices off these old stumps one finds in a forest, in moist forests. He's been working in dry forests and finding, the pattern also. So if you have like a 500-year-old ponderosa pine or Douglas fir or cedar, red cedar, you can see where the fire scars are. And all of those, many of those were harvested by the settlers for, production, for, financial reason. So what Andrew and others are finding are, before 1830, and then again, even before the, 1730-ish, there were like very, very frequent fires, even in drought years. I mean, even in very wet years, there were frequent fires. So in some places, fire return intervals of 5 to 8 years in moist forests.
Wow.
where there's not supposed to be any
There
fire.
shouldn't be. Yeah. Yeah.
And
Yeah.
where the common understanding is that Native people didn't have any impact in these moist forests, right?
Sure.
But you talk to tribal elders from some of the tribes in Oregon on the coast, like the Coos Bay tribes, the Confederated tribes of the Coos, Lower Umpqua, and Siuslaw Indians. And they share stories, the elders, of, oh yeah, the ridge runners used to set these fires in the fall, after they finished their hunt, and
Amazing.
that improved the berries for the deer for the next year and also for us. And, so they have all these stories. And one of the things, in the project I lead in Oregon, that Tom DeLuca is a co-PI, and he's also several of the co-authors of this report are co-PIs on that project. We're doing things like putting in these randomly selected plots in moist forests and digging soil pits and going back nearly a meter and finding very frequent, like hundreds of layers of pyrogenic carbon, which is basically charcoal that is only generated when there's been a very low severity light burn, such as a cultural burn. Like you don't get that from, severe wildfires.
Yeah.
And so, and elders in the field with us going, see, we told you so, and this was like at the base of a cedar stump, right? That was like the size of a room. It was a huge tree.
That's fantastic.
So there's these, this is the braiding of the sweetgrass. Western science is corroborating the indigenous knowledge. Mm-hmm. Not that it should ever need to be corroborated, but it's just really wonderful when everything lines up like that.
No kidding.
So this is the paradigm shift, right? So the problem is that we departed greatly from the patterns with which these forests co-evolved, which is cultural burning. Yeah. And also humans cutting trees as needed to build canoes, for example, or longhouses. And so these forests have become far more dense than they ever were historically. The idea of a closed canopy forest is unlikely that one existed as a continuous carpet of trees even in the Pacific Northwest. And so because these trees are so departed from these historic conditions, densification is also encouraged by carbon credits and the idea that, to combat climate change, we need to get as many trees sequestering carbon. That's the problem. Those are the changes that are causing, the catastrophic wildfires and the disease outbreaks. And our report, we referred to it as greatly reducing the climate resilience of those forests.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, we need more resilience. We need more system level thinking, and that totally makes sense.
Yeah, and on system level thinking, Native people had a keen awareness of the soil and how their cultural practices kept the soil healthy.
Sure.
And this is globally in all kinds of systems, and fire was one of the key ways they kept soil healthy, because when that pyrogenic carbon I mentioned, they're like bits of charcoal in the soil, can last up to 5,000 years. If you look at it under a microscope, it contains lots of pores. Okay. Those pores hold water. When there's a drought year, they hold water from the wet years that they're like sponges. Yeah. Additionally, pyrogenic carbon greatly increases the nitrogen cycle, and that's the flow of nutrient to trees. So by eliminating cultural burning, we did damage to these forests without realizing it. Mm-hmm. Settlers did in multiple ways.
Yes, absolutely. No, that totally makes sense. And I think that covers a lot of the third recommendation that you had in this report as well, which was the provide flexibility to steward dynamic landscapes and navigate uncertainties under rapidly changing conditions. I think that covers that idea really well, right? Explaining that these are dynamic, changing landscapes. They always were, and they only stopped being once colonization happened. And it's going to force our hand, and like nature will force our hand if it has to. But if we can be smart about it and start to manage them proactively and dynamically, then we stand a chance, right? So.
Yeah, and what some of that refers to is the paradigm shift. And we talked about Jasper and Waterton Lakes National Park. So flexibility in stewardship means being able to go into a reserve site that is highly at risk of experiencing severe wildfire and doing something like removing understory trees that provide ladder fuels. And some of those trees might be non-native species that were planted at some point, right? So using ecocultural restoration to restore some of the former structure of that forest with very respectful thinning that is done by having elders out in the field with you, telling you, take that tree. No, don't take that one, And keeping the elder trees, the elders, the old, big old trees. And that opens up the canopy, that encourages seed banks of things like sweetgrass and encourages berry growth, and then doing a low severity cultural burn. It also means cultural burning normally in the U.S. can take up to 2 years to have it approved by a tribe.
Right.
So, so, Environmental Protection Agency regulations. And so cultural burns are not done like lines on a map, the way prescribed burn is being done. They're two very different things. So flexibility to apply cultural burning means, and it also cultural burning, I mentioned people used to burn in the fall. They burned when the forest told them it was time to burn. Yeah. And it depended. And so you can't predict that if you're, creating a proposal for a burn permit. Yeah. That isn't going to get approved for 2 years. I mean, there goes your flexibility, right?
Yeah. Your burn window's 3 days and you don't know what happens until it's there and you don't have time for red tape. Yeah. I feel like that's where that decentralized authority comes from, right? That place-based thinking about making sure people have the authority to go about doing this management when the time happens, right? Not needing to go through the red tape. That's holding people back.
And that's some of what happened with the giant sequoias in California is the tribes wanted to do ecocultural burning, and we're not allowed to do that. And it became a big debate. The federal government wanted it to happen, but, conservation organizations said, no touch, these are sacred trees and these are preserves. And part of it was a national park. And of course it all burned up, like the tribes predicted it would.
Right.
Right. So that's the proactive piece is let's do what we can to steward these forests and be proactive about it.
Yeah, absolutely. That totally makes sense. Yeah. It's frustrating when you have people with good intentions trying to do what they think is the right thing, but they're missing a piece of knowledge that is crucial to the reality.
Yeah, and that's why sharing these stories and the work that you do with these podcasts is so important. And that's our cultural traditional way is we tell stories.
Yeah. I love it. It's how I learn. If you know what I mean? Yeah. Bringing that context, like it's one thing to read something on a page. It's another thing to humanize it and make it real and have that context to help, just kind of settle it in your mind and really understand it. I need that. And that's why I do this podcast. Yeah, absolutely. So the fourth recommendation that you had, grounding agency planning and land and resource stewardship policies in ethics of reciprocity and responsibility to maintain future human generations. I feel like we've covered that quite well too, but I think I would like to reiterate this idea of reciprocity because I think people are aware of this term but I think I would like to give you the opportunity to really paint a picture for people of what this means. Because I think it's an important concept that really brings home the whole idea of this report, I think.
Yeah, reciprocity I found it to be a core value in every Indigenous community I worked with around the world in places like Amazonia, Mongolia, everywhere, the high Arctic, in the Canadian high Arctic. It is the opposite of capitalism.
Yeah.
Capitalism is about endless growth to benefit humans financially. Reciprocity is we're responsible for these forests or this grassland or this species of animal. And so we also rely on them for survival. So let's, take what we need mindfully and give back more. And there is no such thing as unlimited growth.
Right.
That's a fundamental thing as a Western scientist. I'm a very formally trained Western scientist, and it's like it doesn't happen in nature.
I don't understand, our Western society's obsession, the business obsession with this infinite growth model that is not possible, but we seem to think that we can just keep pushing that and it's going to be okay. And we know it's not. It's impossible. It's the laws of physics don't allow it, let alone the law of supply and demand. And but we seem to never learn. It's interesting.
And what we're seeing is ecosystems crashing. And out of the ashes, we'll have systems, and maybe there won't be people around. That's how bad it's getting, right?
Yeah. No, we need to take stock that I think, and people like to think like, oh, that's not going to happen. Like, we're smart, we'll figure it out. And it's like, man, I don't know. Like, there's, are we smart?
Climate smart solutions, right?
Yeah. No, there needs to be a lot of work if we're gonna figure it out, and that means changing the way we think about it, removing this concept of infinite growth, and moving to this idea of reciprocity, that we depend on the land, and the land depends on us in some regard if we want to live in harmony with it, right? And I think this idea of putting certain parts of the land in a box and you save it, and this part we can work with and this part we can't, we need to remove that and just recognize that all the cogs and wheels are important. We need to keep them all, and we need to work with them all. We need to steward them all. And it's the reciprocity idea is so interesting to me.
The protected reserve idea was in response to all of the rampant clear cutting, but both come from the same model as humans being in control of nature.
Yeah, totally.
And we know that's a total myth, right?
Yeah,
humans, right. So,
we have thumbs, so we can cut it down, but it's not. Doesn't mean we're control. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's a misunderstanding of the reality of human relationship to nature, and just kind of perversing our control into this godlike power that just is not true. We're just as much at the mercy of nature as any other animal. Yeah, no, for sure. So the fifth and final recommendation that you guys had, I thought was an interesting one. That Catalyze innovative approaches to forest stewardship. So what does that mean to you? Because it sounds to me like you're saying, let's keep the ball rolling. Let's keep thinking. Let's keep discussing how things are changing and keep things moving in the right direction. But what does that mean to you?
Well, it has to do with that two-eyed seeing model. And, it's a cycle that keeps repeating, and it costs money to do this. So where this has historically fallen apart has to do with monitoring.
Okay.
And early in the process, our federal agencies tend to function on very tight budgets, and our national governments need to prioritize funding the Forest Service, for example, to adequately allow for monitoring and funding tribal partners and building more of a workforce. So it's learning by doing. That's Indigenous knowledge.
Yeah.
Right. And so
love that.
How you learn, you do, and then you measure the outcome to see, well, what happened here? And then you take what you learned and you create the next iteration. And that is adaptive reciprocal stewardship. There needs to be dedicated funding for that. And that is something that's coming out of the tribal roundtables. It's like, this is all great, but how is this going to happen without adequate funding?
Absolutely. Yeah.
So this is a call for funding, and I predict that moving forward, monitoring, which has always historically been downplayed. I mean, sometimes it's done very well, but more often there's a very small sliver of funds for that, and it's done in a very cursory way. Monitoring is super important, and it's part of our relationship with those landscapes.
Yeah, isn't that interesting that it's because monitoring is not the innovative, sexy way, sexy new idea. It doesn't get that support, but it's needed to actually understand if what you're doing is the right thing to do, right?
Yeah. And then the community approaches in the US, we have extension programs, which are also considered by some people as, well, that's nice, but you're just getting, local people involved. But this is really where, we can tap into the local passions and connections to these landscapes, these forests. And that can be part of, the stewardship is in the US, getting extension programs engaged in this.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that's a crucial point, right? In that, how can there be co-stewardship without the same level of resources equally, right? Like, we know that Western science has just ridiculous amount of resources, but how can Indigenous knowledge be supported if there isn't the same amount of resources, right? And there needs to be that access to resources, to funding, to do this work if we want it to work out properly, if it is going to be true co-stewardship, right? And I think that totally makes sense in my mind. Yeah. This whole report, you guys did such an excellent job from somebody who's able to see this from the sidelines and see it coming. And I've had a lot of these types of conversations. It opened up a lot of the ideas that I think I had a cursory understanding of. And the report did such a good job of explaining, because you said you spent so much time on the wording, on the specifics of each word, and really allowed me to open up my understanding and really, I think, specifically help me ground myself in what all these ideas mean. And I found it really refreshing, and I found it really engaging, and it helped me understand it better. So I really appreciate all the work that's gone into this, because it's just, I can't imagine.
Well, thank you for that, Matt. That means a lot. I will say that the reason for this innovation in our report, bringing together best Western science with Indigenous knowledge, is the freedom that we had. And the Forest Service totally was supportive in every way possible, and did not at all get involved in what we were writing, how we were writing it. If anything, they encouraged us to speak more openly about the things that you and I have been conversing about. The other thing I will say is the academic freedom that I have at Oregon State University in the College of Forestry. My supervisor is the Dean of the College of Forestry, who's also a co-author, Tom DeLuca, and he's a systems thinker. He thinks very holistically. He created the position that I'm in because he immediately, when he was hired, said, we need to bring in an Indigenous scholar who in a leadership position. And so, he strongly supported me devoting so much of my time to this, and there were never any sideboards on it. It was just run with it, Cristina. Yeah. And so I was able to do that, right? And that doesn't always happen. There's some controversial ideas in here because it's about a paradigm shift.
Totally.
So, and innovators like Michael Nelson were able to be bold and frank about things, right?
Yeah.
So, it was a dream project. And right now we're in the process of writing and submitting journal articles. The journal Nature is very interested in a synthesis from our report. Yeah.
Very cool.
And so, and Nature interviewed me about some of the concepts in the report for an article that was published in Nature Methods recently.
Oh. That's awesome.
So, there will be more to come. Yeah. And I mean, it's about telling stories that need to be told, right? So, and I'm really grateful to you, and I give you my thanks and Susan's thanks as well. I wish she could have been here today.
No, I'm so grateful for getting the opportunity to speak with you. And I'm sorry Susan couldn't be here, but I was really glad to get to meet you and break this down, because I think it's just it's important. And these paradigm shifts, it seems like this is the way. This is what we have to do. And the more we can talk about it, the more we can get different people's ideas and perspectives out there, the more I think it starts to become the normal way of thinking about it, right? And I'm just excited. I'm excited to see how this starts to take shape, and this idea of action, right? Like that last recommendation of, hey, we need to actually do stuff, see how it works, and then adjust course. I love that, right? It's just like, let's start doing things. It's great. Yeah, this was really fantastic, Cristina. I really appreciate you taking the time to do this. So this is really, really good.
Well, thank you, Matt, and I hope to meet you in person someday.
Yeah, me too. Thank you so much for listening. Wasn't that awesome? I really learned a lot. Like I think it helps to talk through these things and really try to suss out how this can be operational, how we can make this work, how we can open up our hearts and our minds to these ideas and get this going. Because it's just, I don't know, it's exciting stuff. I love it. So thank you, Cristina, for your time. Thank you to all the other authors of this report. It was so well done. And make sure to download it. Again, it's out there in the show notes. It's open source, so you can download it, read it, whatever you want to do. It's all there. Great, really cool artwork in there as well. So I definitely recommend reading it in detail, especially if you're a forest manager or something like that. It's great. So yeah, thanks a lot for listening. Please give this show a rating, a review, share it with your friends and family. It's how it gets out there. It's how we share these cool stories. I'd really appreciate it. Thank you very much. And catch y'all next time. Take it easy.